Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
What if I told you I paid every single one of my brother's bills for 5 years, and the first time I showed up empty-handed, he told me I didn't belong at Christmas? The way it all started was never loud or dramatic. It wasn't some grand betrayal or sudden shift. It was slow, quiet, the kind of thing that builds up over years until you realize you're carrying a weight you never signed up for. And then someone you've supported for years laughs in your face like you're the joke. This past Christmas, I learned just how disposable people think you are when they get too comfortable using you. Darren, my older brother, has always had a way of dominating the room. Growing up, he was the golden boy, the straight-A student, the varsity athlete, the one who got praised for things like potential and drive while I was told to be more like him. I wasn't jealous, not in the bitter way. I just got used to being the background support while he took the spotlight. When we both hit adulthood, that dynamic didn't really change. Darren married a woman who loved the image of being married to a successful man. She quit working after the wedding and leaned hard into the CEO wife aesthetic. What she never saw, and what Darren never admitted, was that I was the one making sure their shiny life didn't fall apart. It started with little things. I offered to cover my niece's preschool payments when Darren's consulting gig dried up for a few months. He promised it was temporary. I believed him. But months turned into years, and somehow it just became understood that Auntie would handle tuition. Then came the private health insurance they couldn't afford after his self-employment kicked in. Then the house alarm system, the tutoring, the summer camps. I didn't even notice how automatic it had all become, how I'd become a monthly silent donor to their life, until that moment at Christmas. That year, I had a rough quarter at work. I'd taken a demotion to escape a toxic team, and I was focusing on my mental health for once instead of chasing promotions or raises. I'd cut back on my spending. I didn't bring gifts for everyone, just for the kids. I came with a casserole, a bottle of mid-tier wine, and the intention to just be present. I didn't expect a standing ovation, but I also didn't expect what Darren said. It was after dinner. Everyone was relaxing, talking about vacation plans and new tech gadgets, and Darren stood up with a glass in his hand to make one of his signature toasts. He always did this thing where he tried to sound inspirational, like a TED Talk, but it came off like he was doing an impression of someone who cared. He started with some story about resilience and family values. Then he smiled and said, "Let's raise a glass to those of us who worked hard, pushed forward, and actually have something to show for it. This Christmas is for the ones who kept climbing, not the ones who just showed up." He didn't look at me directly. He didn't have to. The smirk was enough. The silence afterward? Even louder. My parents didn't say a word. His wife gave that half-laugh people give when they know something's inappropriate, but they kind of agree. My sister looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And I just sat there, holding my half-filled wine glass, feeling heat rise in my chest, not from shame, but from something deeper. Something slow and sharp. I didn't say a word. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I realized, right then and there, that my words had never mattered to them as much as my money did. The rest of the evening dragged on. People laughed, opened gifts, took pictures by the tree. I played along. Smiled when necessary, helped clean up, hugged my niece, avoided Darren. And when it was all over, I drove home in silence, not even turning on the radio. Just thinking. Back in my apartment, I poured the leftover wine into a mug and opened my laptop. I clicked on the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining for years, Darren Family Autopays, and looked at the list. School tuition, paid through my card. Health insurance, billed quarterly to my account. Utilities. I'd been paying the gas bill since the winter they claimed their heat got shut off. I scrolled through line after line, realizing something I should have acknowledged long ago. My brother's life only worked because I was quietly holding the back end. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't spiral into self-pity. I just stared at that spreadsheet and thought, let's see how successful they feel without the unpaid intern propping it all up. I didn't make a decision right then. I just bookmarked the tab, closed the laptop, slept better than I had in weeks. Because when someone finally shows you what they really think of you, not with screaming, not with insults, but with that one smirk, That one sentence that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. You stop defending them. You stop justifying their behavior. You stop giving them power. And sometimes you start planning. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do. But I knew one thing. Nothing in their world was actually theirs. And they were about to find out what happened when the foundation they ignored suddenly disappeared. There's something darkly liberating about watching people scramble when you quietly stop saving them from themselves. I used to think that withholding help made you a bad person, especially when it came to family, especially when it came to kids. But the truth is, there's a fine line between generosity and enabling, and I had crossed it so many times that I forgot what the line even looked like. After that Christmas, after that smug little speech from Darren, I sat down the next morning, logged into every account with my name on it, and started pulling threads. Not out of rage, not even out of bitterness, just out of clarity. For the first time in years, I saw exactly what was happening, and I didn't want to participate anymore. I started small, not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted the unraveling to feel gradual. Not an explosion, but a slow collapse. I canceled the tutoring payments first. Their daughter, Maddie, had been going to a private math tutor twice a week, and for years, the charges came through my card automatically. When they first asked for help, it was a one-time thing. Maddie was struggling, and I cared about her, so of course I agreed. But that one time became monthly, then quarterly, then indefinite. I never asked for reimbursement. They never offered. It just became mine to handle, like so many other things. So I stopped. I opened the billing site, disabled the card, and closed the tab. A few days later, I got a polite email from the tutoring center saying they were unable to process the latest payment. I didn't respond. That same day, I went after the gas and electric bills. Years ago, Darren called in a panic one winter because their gas had been shut off. He said it was just a glitch, some kind of billing issue, and they'd pay me back right away. I covered the past due balance and, for convenience, left my card on file. That was 5 years ago. I logged in, removed my card, and requested a final invoice. Then I canceled their monthly home insurance premiums. Then the backup internet account they set up under my name when their provider supposedly overcharged them. Each cancellation felt like peeling off another layer of something sticky and invisible that had been clinging to me for too long. I wasn't taking anything from them. I was simply returning to neutral. Within a week, the cracks started to show, and I didn't even need to look for signs. The first real indication came in the form of a missed call from my sister-in-law, Claire. No voicemail. Just a call. Then a text. Hey, not sure if you got my message, but I think there's some issue with the school billing. Could you check? I waited a few hours before responding, just long enough for the panic to simmer. Then I replied, I canceled the payment plan. It's their account now. No explanation. No apology. Just a handoff of responsibility that was never mine to begin with. The reply came quickly. Wait, what? Darren didn't say anything. Are you sure this isn't a mistake? I read that line twice, smiled without smiling, and left it on read. I'd spent years being the safety net they never acknowledged. Now they'd feel the floor. I didn't want to hurt anyone, especially not the kids, but I also wasn't going to protect people who saw me as disposable. Darren hadn't even spoken to me since Christmas. Not even a passive-aggressive follow-up. Just radio silence, as if I was supposed to be too embarrassed to push back. He probably thought I'd slink away, humiliated. Instead, I was calmly disassembling the scaffolding around their carefully curated life. 3 days later, the school called me directly. A woman named Denise from the finance office said they'd been unable to reach the family about the declined tuition payments and noticed I had been the payer of record. She wanted to confirm whether I'd be continuing the arrangement. I told her no as plainly as I could. I will not be making any further payments. Please contact the parents directly. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard, then thanked me and hung up. I could imagine how that next phone call went, the one she made to Claire or Darren, and part of me felt guilty, but a much larger part of me felt something else. Not joy. Not revenge. Just alignment. That night, I got another message from Claire, this one longer. She tried to sound gracious, but I could feel the panic slipping through. Look, I understand if things are tight right now, but we're just asking for a little more time to get things sorted. This was really sudden, and Darren wasn't even aware you'd stopped the payments. That line almost made me laugh. Darren wasn't aware? Of course he wasn't. Because Darren had built his entire identity around not being aware. Around outsourcing hard things to other people. Around assuming someone else would always clean up his mess while he played successful entrepreneur in front of the world. I didn't respond that night. Instead, I opened the spreadsheet again. There were still a few more charges, some streaming subscriptions, the dental plan, the emergency savings transfer I'd been doing quietly into their account every month, just in case. I looked at each one like a puzzle piece that no longer fit. Then, one by one, I clicked cancel, close, remove. By the end of the week, nothing remained with my name on it. I wasn't their bank. I wasn't their fallback. I wasn't going to pretend anymore that helping them hadn't turned into hiding their failures. And the best part? I didn't need to explain myself. They could call it dramatic. They could call it betrayal. But I hadn't betrayed them. I had just stopped pretending I owed them a damn thing. There's a strange moment of quiet that follows the first visible crack in a carefully built lie. For years, Darren had presented a version of his life that looked polished, impressive, stable, and above all, self-made. The house in a good neighborhood, the 2 SUVs in the driveway, the Instagram-perfect vacations, the private school drop-offs, the designer clothes on his wife and kids, it all formed a narrative he clung to like a man afraid of drowning in the truth. But what most people didn't know, what even he refused to fully acknowledge, was that the rope holding that narrative together wasn't tied to his bank account or his talent. It was tied to mine. The first call came early on a Tuesday morning. I recognized the area code immediately and let it go to voicemail. A minute later, the message appeared in my inbox, polite, professional, and yet tinged with urgency. Hi, this is Caroline from Administrative Services at West Ridge Academy. We're reaching out regarding your recent payment lapse for Madeline Dawson's tuition. Please give us a call to confirm if there's been a change in the billing arrangement. No emotion. No judgment. Just facts. But to me, that voicemail wasn't just a school asking about money. It was the sound of a reality Darren could no longer outrun. I didn't call back. I had already said what I needed to say, not out loud, but through every canceled autopay, every disabled billing account, every intentional silence. That afternoon, I got the second call, and this time I answered, because I knew avoiding it wouldn't make it go away. Claire's name lit up my phone screen, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out, but something told me this was going to be important. I picked up. Her voice was unusually sweet, the kind of forced sweetness people use when they're trying to sound like they're not furious. She opened with small talk, asked how I was doing, mentioned how fast the kids were growing, and then finally circled around to what she really wanted to say. So, I spoke to the school earlier today, she began, still in that careful tone. They said you stopped the payments for Maddie's tuition? I didn't say anything right away. I wanted to see where she'd take it. We're just a little confused, she continued. Darren said you hadn't mentioned anything. Was this a mix-up? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't apologize. I didn't play dumb. I simply said, it's not a mix-up. I canceled the payments. It's your child. It's your responsibility. There was a pause, just a second too long to be casual, and then she shifted into a different tone, less friendly, more clipped. You know this puts us in a really difficult position. We would have appreciated some warning. I could have said a lot in that moment. I could have reminded her that I never agreed to a lifelong tuition plan. I could have pointed out that for the last 5 years, I'd been single-handedly covering thousands of dollars annually, while Darren played businessman and she played influencer. But I didn't need to say any of it. Instead, I told her, calmly and with zero drama, Claire, I think the real issue here is that you got used to someone else paying for your responsibilities. That's not going to continue. She hung up soon after that, not angrily, but in that icy, brittle way people do when they realize they can't manipulate you anymore. That same evening, my mother called, and I already knew what was coming. She didn't even try to hide the reason. Sweetheart, she started, your brother and Claire are really going through a tough time right now. The school thing was a shock. Maybe you could just help for a little longer while they get things sorted. There it was again, the default assumption that my time, energy, and money existed to cushion Darren's poor planning. I asked her, did Darren call you when I was paying his gas bill? When I was covering Maddie's dental plan? When I paid off their overdue water bill last winter? Silence. She hadn't known. Of course she hadn't. Because none of it counted when I did it quietly. It only became dramatic when I stopped. She tried to spin it, but you never said you were struggling, and I cut her off. I'm not struggling. That's not the point. The point is, no one asked if I wanted to keep paying. It was just assumed. And now that I've said no, suddenly it's a problem. The next few days were filled with texts that oscillated between guilt trips, subtle threats, and fake pleasantries. Darren still hadn't called. Not once. I got a vague group family message wishing everyone a happy new year, which felt almost insulting considering everything going on. But that was Darren's style. When cornered, pretend nothing's wrong and wait for someone else to fix it. The truth was, he wasn't calling because he was still hoping this would all blow over. That I'd back down. That I'd feel guilty. That I'd fix it again. But I wasn't that person anymore. Not because I'd suddenly become cold or vindictive, but because I finally saw the dynamic for what it was. I had been subsidizing someone else's fantasy while being treated like an embarrassment. And the moment I stopped playing along, they didn't reflect, they didn't apologize, they panicked. That week, I checked my bank accounts again, just to make sure everything was officially unlinked. It was. I stared at the clean slate for a while, not in pride, but in disbelief. I had allowed myself to become the invisible infrastructure holding up someone else's illusion of success, and for the first time, I wasn't holding it anymore. Now, the cracks were beginning to show, and the people who once saw me as background noise were about to get very loud. I used to think that people like Darren would never come crawling, not because they were too proud, but because they were too entitled to realize they had anything to crawl about in the first place. My brother had lived his whole adult life with the unshakable belief that the world, and more specifically the people around him, existed to make sure his plans went smoothly, his image stayed clean, and his problems stayed other people's responsibility. So when he finally reached out, not through a polite call, not through a thoughtful message, but by showing up at my door unannounced, I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel satisfaction. What I felt was something closer to observation, like watching a man realize the machine he'd been riding on wasn't powered by talent or strategy, but by the quiet person he never thought to think. He didn't knock aggressively, but he didn't wait long either. I opened the door to find him standing there with a forced smile that barely concealed the desperation in his eyes. He looked tired, not in the way people look after a bad night's sleep, but in the way people look when reality has been correcting itself around them, and they're just now noticing how much of their life was built on borrowed grace. "Hey," he said, too casually for everything that had happened. "Thought maybe we could talk." I let him in, not because I owed him kindness, but because I wanted to hear what kind of spin he'd try to put on this situation. He sat down like someone trying to look relaxed while suppressing panic, and for a moment we both just sat there in silence, the kind of silence that used to be filled by my willingness to smooth things over. "So," he started, "Claire's been really stressed. The school situation's gotten out of hand. And, utilities are late. And I guess there was an issue with the insurance." He spoke like it was all happening to him, like some unknown force had just decided to torment his family out of nowhere. There was not a single acknowledgement of what had actually changed, me. I didn't respond right away, and that silence seemed to push him into the next phase, the one where charm gives way to guilt tripping. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and said, "I get it. Things have been tough. I should have reached out sooner. But you know how it is, life moves fast, we all make mistakes. I think maybe this just got out of control." I looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that only comes after years of emotional gaslighting. "It didn't get out of control," I said. "It got revealed." That clearly wasn't the direction he wanted this conversation to go. He adjusted his posture, smiled nervously, and said, "Come on, it's not like we expected you to pay for everything. It just sort of happened, you know? Like, family helps each other." That line, "family helps each other," almost made me laugh out loud. Not because it wasn't true in theory, but because in practice, what Darren really meant was you help us and we don't talk about it. I stood up, walked over to my kitchen counter, and grabbed my phone. I scrolled for a few seconds, found what I was looking for, and turned the screen toward him. It was a screenshot of the spreadsheet, the same one I had used to track every single payment, every subscription, every autopay, every quiet bailout. I had color-coded it, not for drama, but for clarity. Red for canceled. Blue for still active. At the top of the page, in bold, was the line, "Total paid since 2019, $172,000. He stared at it. His face didn't register shock, but something deeper, a dawning comprehension that this wasn't just a few bills or a couple favors. This was the infrastructure of his family's comfort being laid out in black and white, and it all traced back to me. "I didn't pull the rug out from under you," I said, my voice even. "I just stopped vacuuming it for you every week while you stood on it pretending you were on top of the world." He didn't say anything right away, just kept looking at the numbers like they were in another language. Then he muttered something, maybe, I didn't know, maybe, "This is crazy," I couldn't tell. I didn't care. What mattered was that for the first time, he saw it. All of it. He left not long after. There was no big blow-up, no apology, no scene. Just a man walking out of a door he had once assumed would always open for him. Later that night, I got a text, just one sentence. "Can we talk more tomorrow?" I didn't reply. I wasn't angry. I wasn't avoiding him. I was done negotiating with someone who had treated my help like a subscription service, with no cancellation policy. That same evening, I noticed Claire had updated her LinkedIn profile. It was subtle, a few course completions, a job-seeking badge added quietly. But it was there. And something about that made me pause. Not in regret, but in a strange kind of calm. Maybe the house of cards was finally being replaced with something real. Maybe not. But either way, I wasn't going to be the invisible scaffolding holding it up anymore. By morning, I'd blocked Darren's number, not to punish him, but to protect the version of myself I had finally reclaimed. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't careless. I had simply closed the account. It's a strange kind of peace that settles in after you stop saving someone who was never really drowning, just refusing to swim. For weeks after I pulled the plug on Darren's financial lifeline, the silence between us stretched out like a tense thread waiting to snap. I didn't reach out, and he didn't either, at least not directly. But the ripple effects were unmistakable. I started hearing things secondhand. Little bits of information passed through family group chats or mutual acquaintances. Darren was reorganizing, Claire was between projects, and Maddie was suddenly enrolled in a new, much less expensive school across town. None of it was said with anger or blame, at least not publicly. It was all couched in vague language, carefully constructed so they wouldn't have to admit the truth. The life they had built on borrowed support was crumbling now that the borrowing had ended. The first major fallout came from the insurance. Apparently, they hadn't realized just how many accounts were tied to the health plan I had set up, not just dental for the kids, but Claire's therapy sessions, Darren's out-of-network specialist, even the prescription refill plan. I only found out because the provider, still technically linked to my old billing address, sent me a cancellation notice in the mail. I shredded it without even opening it fully. They could figure it out themselves. That was the whole point. For the first time in years, their problems were entirely theirs to manage. No more quiet redirects. No more surprise charges slipping into my statements. No more late-night texts pretending to check in when they were really just fishing for help. My mother, of course, didn't take well to the unraveling. She called me one afternoon with that exasperated tone that always meant I was about to be asked to be the bigger person. She said things like, "Your brother's under a lot of pressure right now, and this isn't the time for grudges." She mentioned that Darren was thinking about selling one of the cars and hinted that Claire might have to go back to work full-time. I could almost hear the horror in her voice when she said it, as if that possibility alone was a reason for me to step in and fix everything again. But I didn't. I listened politely, thanked her for checking in, and made no offers. When she finally asked, "Don't you feel bad seeing them go through this?" I told her the truth. No, I don't feel bad. I feel like I stopped lying to myself about what I was actually doing. What none of them ever understood was that my help hadn't just been financial. It had been emotional labor, constant accommodation, and a willingness to disappear so they could shine. Every dollar I paid was tied to a silence I kept, a boundary I ignored, or a need I suppressed. They had never seen it because they'd never had to. But once that silence ended, once the money stopped flowing, once the obligations were returned to their rightful owners, the illusion shattered. And now, Darren wasn't spiraling because of some unexpected hardship. He was spiraling because he had finally been left alone with the weight of his own life. The last real interaction came in the form of a message forwarded by my sister, a screenshot of Darren's latest motivational social media post. He had written a long caption about rebuilding from rock bottom, about finding out who really supports you when things get hard, and about letting go of toxic energy. He didn't name me directly, but every line screamed projection. He still couldn't face what really happened, that I had quietly enabled his success for years, and when I stepped away, the collapse wasn't sabotage. It was exposure. I laughed when I saw it, not because it was funny, but because it was such a Darren move, to reframe himself as the underdog in a story where he had been the beneficiary all along. He still wanted to be the hero of his narrative, even as the foundation cracked under his feet. And maybe he would be, eventually. Maybe he'd finally learn to stand on his own. But if that happened, it wouldn't be because I came running. It would be because I finally walked away. There was one final thing I had to decide about, something small on paper, but symbolically massive. Years ago, before everything got messy, I had set up a small monthly contribution to a savings account for Maddie, not a trust fund, nothing official, just a quiet little deposit into a custodial account I managed. I did it because I cared about her, because I wanted her to have a cushion someday, a bit of freedom her parents couldn't afford to give. After everything that had happened, I considered closing it. After all, why should I keep giving anything to a family that treated me like an afterthought? But when I looked at her name on the account, I didn't see Claire or Darren. I saw a kid who hadn't asked for any of this. So I changed the payment method, rerouted it through a new account, one that had nothing to do with Darren or Claire, and kept it running. Quietly. Privately. On my own terms. That was the difference now. I wasn't doing things out of obligation, guilt, or fear of being called selfish. I was making choices. Clean ones. Boundaried ones. And the biggest choice of all? I had finally stopped proving my worth through what I could give to people who only noticed me when I gave too little. He can spiral. He can blame. He can craft whatever version of the story makes him sleep at night. But I'm finally awake. And I'm free.